providing high associativity to only these accesses. It was introduced by Norman Jalpe from December in 1990. 27. Intel's Crystal Will 28 variant of its Haswell processors introduced an on-package 128 MB EDRAM level 4 cache which serves as a victim cache to the processor's level 3 cache. 29. In the Skylake Xemic architecture, the level 4 cache no longer works as a victim cache. 30. Trace cache. One of the more extreme examples of cache specialization is the trace cache, also known as execution trace cache, found in the Intel Pentium 4 microprocessors. A trace cache is a mechanism for increasing the instruction fetch bandwidth and decreasing power consumption, in the case of the Pentium 4, by storing traces of instructions that have already been fetched and decoded. 31. A trace cache stores instructions either after they have been decoded, or as they are retired. Generally, instructions are added to trace caches in groups representing either individual basic blocks or dynamic instruction traces. The Pentium 4's trace cache stores micro-operations resulting from decoding x86 instructions, providing also the functionality of a micro-operation cache. Having this, the next time an instruction is needed, it does not have to be decoded into micro-ops again. 32. 6368 Write Coalescing Cache, WCC. Write Coalescing Cache, 33, is a special cache that is part of L2 cache in AMD's Bulldozer microarchitecture. Stores from both L1D caches in the module go through the WCC, where they are buffered and coalesced. The WCC's task is reducing number of writes to the L2 cache. Micro-operation, OP or UOP, cache. A micro-operation cache, OP cache, UOP cache or UC, 34, is a specialized cache that stores micro-operations of decoded instructions, as received directly from the instruction decoders or from the instruction cache. When an instruction needs to be decoded, the OP cache is checked for its decoded form, which are used if cached. If it is not available, the instruction is decoded and then cached. One of the early works describing OP cache as an alternative frontend for the Intel 6P processor family is 2001 paper Micro-Operation Cache, a power-aware frontend for variable instruction length ISA. 35. Later, Intel included OP caches in its Sunday Bridge processors and in successive EMIC architectures like Ivy Bridge and Haswell. 32, 121, 123, 36. AMD implemented a OP cache in their Zen microarchitecture. 37. Fetching complete pre-decoded instructions eliminates the need to repeatedly decode variable-length complex instructions into simpler fixed-length micro-operations, and simplifies the process of predicting fetching, rotating and aligning fetched instructions. A OP cache effectively offloads the fetch and decode hardware, thus decreasing power consumption and improving the front-end supply of decoded micro-operations. The OP cache also increases performance by more consistently delivering decoded micro-operations to the backend and eliminating various bottlenecks in the CPU's fetch and decode logic. 35. 36. A OP cache has many similarities with a trace cache, although a OP cache is much simpler, thus providing better power efficiency. This makes it better suited for implementations on battery-powered devices. The main disadvantage of the trace cache, leading to its power inefficiency, is the hardware complexity required for its heuristic deciding on caching and reusing dynamically created instruction traces. 38. Branch Target Instruction Cache. A branch target cache or branch target instruction cache, the name used on ARM microprocessors, 39, is a specialized cache which holds the first few instructions at the destination of a taken branch. This is used by low-powered processors which do not need a normal instruction cache because the memory system is capable of delivering instructions fast enough to satisfy the CPU without one. However, this only applies to consecutive instructions in sequence. It still takes several cycles of latency to restart instruction fetch at a new address, causing a few cycles of pipeline bubble after a control transfer. A branch target cache provides instructions for those few cycles, avoiding a delay after most taken branches. This allows full-speed operation with a much smaller cache than a traditional full-time instruction cache. Smart cache. Smart cache is a level 2 or level 3 caching method for multiple execution cores, developed by Intel. Smart cache shares the actual cache memory between the cores of a multi-core processor. In comparison to dedicated per-core cache, the overall cache miss rate decreases when not all cores need equal parts of the cache space. Consequently, a single core can use the full level 2 or level 3 cache, if the other cores are inactive. 40. Furthermore, the shared cache makes it faster to share memory among different execution cores. 41. Multi-level caches. Another issue is the fundamental trade-off between cache latency and hit rate. Larger caches have better hit rates but longer latency. To address this trade-off, many computers use multiple levels of cache, with small fast caches backed up by larger, slower caches. Multi-level caches generally operate by checking fastest, level 1, L1, cache first. If it hits, the processor proceeds at high speed. If that smaller cache misses, the next fastest cache, level 2, L2, is checked, and so on, before accessing external memory. As the latency difference between main memory and the fastest cache has become larger, some processors have begun to utilize as many as 3 levels of on-chip cache. Price-sensitive designs used this to pull the entire cache hierarchy on chip. But by the 2010s some of the highest performance designs returned to having large off-chip caches, which is often implemented in EDIM and mounted on a multi-chip module as a fourth cache level. In rare cases, such as in the mainframe CPU IBM Z15, 2019, all levels down to L1 are implemented by EDIM, replacing SRAM entirely. For cache, SRAM is still used for registers. Therm-based Apple M1 has a 192 kilobytes L1 cache for each of the 4 high-performance cores, an unusually large amount. However, the 4 high-efficiency cores only have 128 KB. The benefits of L3 and L4 caches depend on the application's access patterns. Examples of products incorporating L3 and L4 caches include the following: Alpha 21164, 1995, has 1 to 64 megabytes off-chip L3 cache. IBM Power 4, 2001, has off-chip L3 caches of 32 megabytes per processor, shared among several processors. Itanium 2, 2003, has a 6 megabytes unified level 3, L3, cache on die. The Itanium 2, 2003, MX2 module incorporates 2 Itanium 2 processors along with a shared 64 megabytes L4 cache on a multi-chip module that was pin compatible with a Madison processor. Intel's Xeon MP product codenamed Tulsa, 2006, features 16 megabytes of on-die L3 cache shared between 2 processor cores. AMD Phenom 2, 2008, has up to 6 megabytes on-die unified L3 cache. Intel Core i7, 2008, has an 8 megabytes on-die unified L3 cache that is inclusive, shared by all cores. Intel Haswell CPUs with integrated Intel Iris Pro graphics have 128 megabytes of EDIM acting essentially as an L4 cache. 42. Finally, at the other end of the memory hierarchy, The CPU register file itself can be considered the smallest, fastest cache in the system, with the special characteristic that it is scheduled in software typically by a compiler, as it allocates registers to hold values retrieved from main memory for, as an example, loop nest optimization. However, with register renaming, most compiler register assignments are reallocated dynamically by hardware at runtime into a register bank, allowing the CPU to break false data dependencies and thus easing pipeline hazards. Register files sometimes also have hierarchy. The Cray-1, circa 1976, had 8 addresser and 8 scalar data S registers that were generally usable. There was also a set of 64 address B and 64 scalar data T registers that took longer to access, but were faster than main memory. The B and T registers were provided because the Cray-1 did not have a data cache. The Cray-1 did, however, have an instruction cache. Multi-core chips. When considering a chip with multiple cores, there is a question of whether the caches should be shared or local to each core. Implementing shared cache inevitably introduces more wiring and complexity. But then having one cache per chip, rather than core, greatly reduces the amount of space needed, and thus one can include a larger cache. Typically, sharing the L1 cache is undesirable because the resulting increase in latency would make each core run considerably slower than a single core chip. However, for the highest level cache, the last one echoed before accessing memory, having a global cache is desirable for several reasons, such as allowing a single core to use the whole cache, reducing data redundancy by making it possible for different processors or threads to share cached data, and reducing the complexity of utilized cache coherency protocols. 43. For example, an 8-core chip with 3 levels may include an L1 cache for each core, one intermediate L2 cache for each pair of cores, and one L3 cache shared between all cores. Shared highest level cache, which is called before accessing memory, is usually referred to as the last level cache, LLC. Additional techniques are used for increasing the level of parallelism when LLC is shared between multiple cores, including slicing it into multiple pieces which are addressing certain ranges of memory addresses, and can be accessed independently. 44. Separate versus unified. In a separate cache structure, instructions and data are cached separately, meaning that a cache line is used to cache either instructions or data, but not both. Various benefits have been demonstrated with separate editor and instruction translation look-aside buffers. 45. In a unified structure, this constraint is not present, and cache lines can be used to cache both instructions and data. Exclusive versus inclusive. Multi-level caches introduce new design decisions. For instance, in some processors, all data in the L1 cache must also be somewhere in the L2 cache. These caches are called strictly inclusive. Other processors, like the AMD Athlon, have exclusive caches. Data is guaranteed to be in at most one of the L1 and L2 caches, never in both. Still other processors, like the Intel Pentium 2, 3, and 4, do not require that data in the L1 cache also reside in the L2 cache, although it may often do so. There is no universally accepted name for this intermediate policy. Winking sad smiley. 46, 47. Two common names are non-exclusive and partially inclusive. The advantage of exclusive caches is that they store more data. This advantage is larger when the exclusive L1 cache is comparable to the L2 cache, and diminishes if the L2 cache is many times larger than the L1 cache. When the L1 misses and the L2 hits on an access, the hitting cache line in the L2 is exchanged with a line in the L1. This exchange is quite a bit more work than just copying a line from L2 to L1, which is what an inclusive cache does. 47. One advantage of strictly inclusive caches is that when external devices or other processors in a multiprocessor system wish to remove a cache line from the processor, they need only have the processor check the L2 cache. In cache hierarchies which do not enforce inclusion, the L1 cache must be checked as well. As a drawback, there is a correlation between the associativities of L1 and L2 caches. If the L2 cache does not have at least as many ways as all L1 caches together, the effective associativity of the L1 caches are restricted. Another disadvantage of inclusive cache is that whenever there is an eviction in L2 cache, the, possibly, corresponding lines in L1 also have to get evicted in order to maintain inclusiveness. This is quite a bit of work, and would result in a higher L1 miss rate. 47. Another advantage of inclusive caches is that the larger cache can use larger cache lines, which reduces the size of the secondary cache tags. Exclusive caches require both caches to have the same size cache lines so that cache lines can be swapped on a L1 miss, L2 hit. If the secondary cache is an order of magnitude larger than the primary, and the cache data is an order of magnitude larger than the cache tags, this tag area saved can be comparable to the incremental area needed to store the L1 cache data in the L2. 48. Scratchpad memory. Scratchpad memory, SPM, also known as scratchpad RAM or local store in computer terminology, is a high-speed internal memory used for temporary storage of calculations, data, and other work in progress. Example, the K8. To illustrate both specialization and multi-level caching, here is the cache hierarchy of the K8 core in the AMD Athlon 64 CPU. 49. Cache hierarchy of the K8 core in the AMD Athlon 64 CPU. The K8 has 4 specialized caches, an instruction cache, an instruction TLB, a data TLB, and a data cache. Each of these caches is specialized. The instruction cache keeps copies of 64-byte lines of memory, and fetches 16 bytes each cycle. Each byte in this cache is stored in 10 bits rather than 8, with the extra bits marking the boundaries of instructions. This is an example of predecoding. The cache hastily parity protection rather than ECC, because parity is smaller and any damaged data can be replaced by fresh data fetched from memory, which always has an up-to-date copy of instructions. The instruction TLB keeps copies of page table entries, PTEs. Each cycle's instruction fetch has its virtual address translated through this TLB into a physical address. Each entry is either 4 or 8 bytes in memory. Because the K8 has a variable page size, each of TLBs is split into 2 sections, one to keep PTEs that map 4 kilobytes pages, and one to keeps that map 4 megabytes or 2 megabytes pages. The split allows the fully associative match circuitry in each section to be simpler. The operating system maps different sections of the virtual address space with different size PTEs. The data TLB has 2 copies which keep identical entries. The 2 copies allow 2 data accesses per cycle to translate virtual addresses to physical addresses. Like the instruction TLB, this TLB is split into 2 kinds of entries. The data cache keeps copies of 64-byte lines of memory. It is split into 8 banks, each storing 8 KB of data, and can fetch 2 8-byte data each cycle so long as those data are in different banks. There are 2 copies of the tags, because each 64-byte line is spread among all 8 banks. Each tag copy handles one of the 2 accesses per cycle. The K8 also has multiple level caches. There are second-level instruction and data TLBs, which store only bytes mapping 4 kilobytes. Both instruction and data caches, and the various TLBs, can fill from the large unified L2 cache. This cache is exclusive to both the L1 instruction and data caches. which means that any 8-byte line can only be in one of the L1 instruction cache, the L1 data cache, or the L2 cache. It is, however, possible for a line in the data cache to have a PTE which is also in one of the TLBs. The operating system is responsible for keeping the TLBs coherent by flushing portions of them when the page tables in memory are updated. The K8 also caches information that is never stored in memory, prediction information. These caches are shown in the above diagram. As is usual for this class of CPU, the K8 has fairly complex branch prediction, with tables that help predict whether branches are taken and other tables which predict their targets of branches and jumps. Some of this information is associated with instructions, in both the level 1 instruction cache and the unified secondary cache. The K8 uses an interesting trick to store prediction information with instructions in the secondary cache. Lines in the secondary cache are protected from accidental data corruption, for example by an alpha particle strike, by either ECC or parity, depending on whether those lines were evicted from the data or instruction primary caches. Since the parity code takes fewer bits than the ECC code, lines from the instruction cache have a few spare bits. These bits are used to cache branch prediction information associated with those instructions. The net result is that the branch predictor has a larger effective history table, and so has better accuracy. More hierarchies. Other processors have other kinds of predictors, for example, the store-to-load bypass predictor in the December Alpha 21264, and various specialized predictors are likely to flourish in future processors. These predictors are caches in that they store information that is costly to compute. Some of the terminology used when discussing predictors is the same as that for caches. One speaks of a hit in a branch predictor, but predictors are not generally thought of as part of the cache hierarchy. The K8 keeps the instruction and data caches coherent in.
Yes, the camcorder is out of power. We have 5 minutes left. It's 3:30 and it's very hot in my apartment, so I have problems to stay awake. Not because I was sleeping, but I'm trying to follow the text. But that's something I have to read again later in the future, so that's very complicated. I have a list there I call read again, so I will add it later. Actually saw something here I will read about later, but that's a problem. I always find something interesting. And I like to get to the Pentiums, so I have to think what I will do that. So this computer CPU, like Intel CPU, that's super complicated. Even a Intel CPU like 20 years old are super complicated. Probably you will not understand how it's working. This is what I am trying to. Even this old CPUs, Intel CPUs, I get very cheap. They are very complicated. Like this first Intel Core i5 650, the first generation. That's and now we have the 12th generation. And the 13th generation, probably we will have it start of next year. They probably already have the 13th generation and they're doing the 14th. They are working many years ahead. But I need to charge my camcorder. Then I will continue. But it's very hot in my apartment. It's been like that every 1 month. Been like 30 degrees or 31, now it's 31. So it's super annoying because everything I have to do it when it's like 31 degrees every day, like 1 month. So, but I have get used to, it's just 30 degrees hot. But I have problems to stay awake. But we have like 1 minute left very soon. I have to stop the video. So I will charge the camcorder. Maybe go out and buy some candy. I'm not sure, I don't think, because I have to weigh my body tomorrow. My body weight. But I will start upload this. We have 1 minute left. I have to put this down. We have to close the camcorder. No, it's 1 month ago. I just got below 100 kilos after like 15 years.